Ascelin, Chapter 1. The murder returned to Ascelin with the early chills of autumn. Small groups on black wings flew over the town, abandoning their nests for the safety of the group. High above the trees and withering rooftops, crying to each other, they came to roost under the stone arches of the asylum at the center of everything. This building was old and majestic, spiraling to the sky in sharp-tipped turrets. The birds nested under its stone arches, though some remained lower in the treetops, and others perched on the grotesque bases of gargoyles which decorated the rising church across the road from the asylum. A strange pair these buildings made, both ancient, reflecting a little history from each passing year, and yet remaining true to their origin. Both had no place here. They were far too great for the smallness of the town, too great for the village Ascelin had started from. But they were the soul, the very identity of the town, and with the wear and tear of the seasons, they remained strong. Fraternal twins with very different purposes. Inside the church, Father O'Brien finished daily mass. Being a weekday, only the elderly knelt in the pews, praying with soft self-reflection. They heard the crows outside and grew cold, a chill which they attributed to the lessening of the sun which danced along the stained glass windows. Inside the asylum, the sound of the crows was greeted by annoyance. Their raucous cawing, heard by the inmates, sparked a chain reaction of screaming and howling. Dr. Samuel Goliath, the head of the asylum, plucked his coat and hat from their rack and donned them, grateful that it would not be him who had to deal with this new problem. Samuel adjusted his scarf and picked his gentleman's cane up from its propped position by the door. He locked his office behind him, stepping out into the empty corridor where the judgmental faces of his ancestors met him, their motionless painted eyes following him as he left. He glanced briefly at his father's portrait before descending the stairs, which caused a brief stir of affection and the fear of disappointing to encroach upon him. This faded, however, as he came to the spacious main hallway where all of the sounds of the asylum swirled together into overwhelming chaos. Here he felt small, an unusual feeling as he stood at least a foot above the rest of the town, and he frequently ducked under doorways. Not so in the asylum, but this was a fleeting feeling, and he was soon on his way again, tipping his hat to Dr. Meeker, his nightly replacement, who was just coming in. Outside, Samuel pulled his collar tighter and glanced at the sky. The air was cool, but felt thick and heavy. No doubt it would rain sometime in the night, but it was not rain he watched for. He eyed the crows suspiciously as he stepped from the cover of the asylum, walking quickly down the path. At his appearance, their cawing grew, and they swooped overhead. The crows calmed a little once he was beyond the asylum gate, and his feet hit the cobbled pavement of the road. By this time Mass had ended, and Father O'Brien stood outside, shaking hands with the exiting devout. They all glanced at the crows before making their ways into the open air. Swinging his cane, Samuel stepped towards the church. His shoes clicked against the pavement, slowly and rhythmically, a sleepy sound for a sleepy town. He nodded greetings to those who noticed him, and waited patiently for the last to be gone, for he had business with the priest. He did not wait long. "Have you found anything?" the doctor asked. Father O'Brien shook his head, his solemn face turning up to the doctor's. "Nothing. The girls are quite good at hiding, if that's indeed what they're doing." He adjusted the little round glasses on his nose, looking just like a stern schoolteacher. "What else would they be doing?" the doctor snapped, and instantly regretted it. The girls had them all worried. "The nights are getting colder and more dangerous. I heard a wolf the other night. It is not the season for running away." "They have a secret fort somewhere, or so I've heard the other children say," the doctor responded, pushing the worries that the priest conjured to the farthest cobwebbed section of his mind. "Let's pray they come back, then. I have my doubts." The priest lowered his head. His shoulders slouched. He was only middle-aged, but the bright spark of life was already draining from him. He was not the man he had been when he first came to Ascelin. Not that he remembered who that was. Indeed, his memories of his days before were irrelevant and very seldom thought of. Right now, his only concerns were for the children. "Another night," the doctor said, more to himself than to the priest. He looked to the sky where the waxing moon crept higher as the sun was lost to sight, the sky red and ominous as the light faded. Without a farewell, their conversation ended and the two parted ways, both entertaining their own private thoughts about what could have befallen the two missing girls. The priests were grim, but the doctors were practical. He weighed the evidence. Both girls had a history of mischief. They were inseparable. Where one went, the other was bound to follow, and the parents were certain that there hadn't been a break-in. The girls had run away, and would be back when they were hungry. The morning came with a light mist, gloomy, wet, and cold. Dr. Samuel sat in the den eating a breakfast of tea and cold sausages. Everything was quiet. Usually, Samuel found the early morning peaceful, and he would sit, eat, perhaps read, and wait for the housekeeper to rap on their door. But today, he was restless. The food felt tasteless on his tongue, and no book could distract him from the sense of urgency building in his chest. Forcing down the last bite of sausage, he stood and paced in front of the fireplace. A dying fire burned behind the grate, keeping the chill at bay. For lack of something to do, he threw a few more logs on, sat back down, and waited. Mrs. Lamb arrived exactly on time, and Samuel met her at the door. "Good morning, Mrs. Lamb," he said, helping her out of her coat. "Good morning. And how is Mrs. Goliath today?" she asked. Samuel's gaze shifted upward. "Still sleeping," he replied, tenderness creeping into his voice as he thought about his pregnant wife resting upstairs. "Getting nervous, are we?" Samuel's head fell back down. "Yes," he smiled, but only briefly. "About that, and other things." "The girls?" Mrs. Lamb asked, and Samuel nodded. "So they haven't come home yet?" "Not unless the rain drove them back in the night." "They'd be foolish to come back in the dark, not if they have a roof over their heads, as makeshift as it might be. But I suppose they were foolish enough to leave in the night. So, perhaps." This was followed by wistful silence, as Samuel's hand hovered over a tall vase holding his cane and umbrella. He chose the umbrella. "We can only hope," he said, taking leave of Mrs. Lamb and stepping into the wet day, where the umbrella did little to keep out the chill. Samuel was alone on his walk to the asylum, as the shops would not open till later. This was another thing he usually enjoyed, but today he felt fearful and jumped at shadows. He would ask for tea when he arrived at work. It would calm his nerves until he had another chance to speak with Father O'Brien. Over the asylum, the crows stirred at Samuel's approach, but they did not make as much fuss as the previous evening. Their droppings covered the ground, and Samuel became more grateful for the umbrella's protection. He shook it out at the asylum doors and went in. The peace and quiet had ended. Unlike the town, the asylum was wide awake. The first sound Samuel heard was a short, dog-like howl. It chilled him just as much as the mist outside. Screams from the cells below answered. Forgetting about his intentions for tea, Samuel followed his usual route to the stairs. He met an orderly coming down, pushing before him a lean, wild man bound in a straitjacket. The man growled at Samuel as he passed. Dr. Meeker stood at the top of the stairs, watching them descend. He frowned after his patient. "Cyril's getting worse," he said, when Samuel hit the top step. "He always does around the full moon," Samuel responded, and followed his colleague into his cluttered office. Dr. Meeker made some noise indicating both assent and doubt. "I've never seen him so bad. He's inciting others into howling all through the night, sundown to sunup. It's that damn wolf. Cyril knows he's out there." "Are you sure it's not the crows? You know how they get." Meeker shook his head. "This has been going on for a few nights now. I think we should consider electric treatment for Cyril. I know it's out of date, but nothing's been working, and your grandfather's notes show it very successful for other lycanthropic patients. He has them talking within a week." He might have had them talking, but what they said was extremely unsettling. They still lived in a delusional world. At least they were talking. Dr. Meeker rubbed his temples. "I might go insane soon from all the noise." He laughed, a tired laugh, and then sighed. He handed his files to Samuel, tapping the top one after they left his hands. "I would suggest you see Jude today." Samuel's eyebrows rose. "He's been getting more vocal, and you won't like what he's been saying." He tapped the file again. Samuel opened it, and at a quick glance spied his name throughout the sloppy shorthand. The writing around it was violent. "I'll look into these," he said, and walked out into the hallway with Meeker. "Go home and get some sleep. It was his usual farewell, and Meeker usually went off with a nod and a wave. But today Meeker paused. "Can't," he said. "I'm on search duty." And as Meeker's light steps descended the stairs, Samuel remembered his tea. Samuel dropped the files on his desk and sunk into his chair. He took a moment to gather his thoughts, organizing his already neat desk. Once satisfied, he rose and pushed a button on a box by the door. It crackled, letting him know it still worked, and he spoke into it. "I'll be having some tea this morning, and make my first appointment Jude." He took a seat again, steepling his hands as if in prayer, index fingers touching his forehead. He was in fact clearing his mind of all sights and sounds. There was nothing to distract him here. All his books sat on a shelf at his back. The walls were bare of art, and no window opened the room to outside influence. The most interesting item in the office was his desk, made of ancient, dark, heavy oak. Carved lion's feet lifted it from the ground, and intricate designs laced the edges. It was exceptionally large, and it fit Samuel perfectly. The faint sounds of church bells through the walls caused him to move. It was time to begin work. He pulled Jude's file toward him. To the untrained eye, the page looked like scribbles and random letters, illegible rubbish, but to Samuel, interpreting Dr. Meeker's handwriting was second nature. It started with a brief description of Jude's body language and general behavior. Lack of eye contact, obsessive rocking, mumbling repeated phrases under his breath. This was all usual for Jude, who seemed to suffer from the violence of internal voices. But then it went into the dialogue. "Goliath must die," read one of the lines. "His blood will set us free." This was the voice talking, Samuel knew, for interspaced between the violent phrases were whimpering no's. The notes went on for 3 more pages, where the voice argued for Samuel's death, and the will of Jude weakened to the point where he lost his speech and just shivered in his seat. Samuel's tea had arrived while he read, and now he sipped it contemplatively. He wasn't the first doctor whose patients wanted him dead. There had been a mass breakout back in the time of the mad doctor, Dr. James P. Goliath. All the staff on shift had been killed that day, the story never forgotten. Tales like that terrified him as a boy, and he remembered, one day, his father coming home with a bite on his hand. For the next few months, Samuel had watched him with silent terror, fearing that his father had been infected by madness. It never happened, of course. He stirred to a light tapping and the slow creaking of the door opening to find a couple peering into his office. He knew them, just as he knew everyone in town, Mr. and Mrs. Edwards. They had that timid look on their faces, and the small, nervous movements of many who came to see him at the asylum. Yet somehow, he didn't think it was mental illness that brought them. "Dr. Samuel?" the implied question being, "Are you busy?" But it wasn't really a question, as they would see him anyway. "Yes?" He himself was cautious with trepidation, his analytical mind searching for their reason to come before they told him. They entered, supporting each other, crowding as close together as Mrs. Edwards' petticoats would allow. She was fighting tears, and Mr. Edwards looked more ashen-faced against the dark colors of his suit than usual. Dr. Samuel waited with a mixture of doctorly patience and anxiety. "It's Hetty," Mrs. Edwards said, her voice soft as a whisper. Mr. Edwards hugged her to him. "She's gone," he finished.